No ballads exist for the darkness that wealth and influence conceal. Certainly not in this place. Not beneath these blazing skies. Here, wickedness moves without sound, hushed as a sealed grave. Evil doesn't announce itself with fury when it strikes. Instead, it shows up unwelcome, lingering patiently until some unfortunate soul is careless enough to let it in. That particular morning, Caleb Thorne made that mistake. The Arizona dawn broke parched and oppressive over Tombstone. Stepping onto his porch with coffee gripped in one hand, Caleb heard familiar wood planks groan beneath his weight. Silence blanketed the land in all directions. Not even a breeze stirred the air. His intention was checking the animals. Instead, his attention locked onto something unexpected, an abandoned wagon, weathered and small, positioned against his fence line, no one at the reins. No wheel marks in the dirt, just scorching heat and dust hanging in the air. A mule stood fastened to the fencing, mindlessly gnawing at air, appearing as though it had been standing there far too long. Beneath a ripped tarp in the wagon bed lay something. Or perhaps a piece of paper was wedged into the rope's knot. Paid in full. Property delivered. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He'd purchased nothing, and besides, what kind of man drops off goods without identification or courtesy? Moving closer, the stench reached him, first perspiration, dried blood, ancient terror. Slowly, he peeled back the covering. A young woman lay there, likely early 20s, covered in grime and bruises, her breathing labored and uncertain. Bindings cut into her wrists. Her lips were split and dry, and visible along her spine were vicious, raised scars, wounds that told stories of deliberate cruelty. Her eyelids lifted. The look she gave him belonged to someone who'd already journeyed through death's door. In a ragged whisper, she said, "You paid for me. Now finish it." Caleb remained motionless, asked nothing, showed no reaction. He simply looked at her. The reality is this: warriors experience combat and believe they've witnessed the depths of suffering. But true torment isn't found on battlefields. Real hell is discovering a broken human being abandoned at your threshold, mutilated and discarded. While someone somewhere congratulates themselves for their generosity, he freed her hands, lifted her carefully, brought her inside to a back room, and settled her down with tenderness. For the first time in many years, Caleb Thorne found himself at a complete loss. But if you believe this tale simply concerns an abandoned girl appearing at a stranger's property, you haven't discovered what burdens she carries. Eliza remained mostly silent during those initial days. Her sleep was restless, the sleep of someone afraid to surrender consciousness for long. Caleb didn't force conversation. He understood silence well enough to respect its natural cadence. Certain men bombard you with questions. He wasn't among them. Instead, he provided warmth, placed food within her reach, kept fresh water and a metal cup beside her bed. Never entered the room. While she was conscious unless absolutely necessary, that particular brand of restraint requires patience, and perhaps carries a touch of conscience as well. When changing her dressings, he'd seen those scars again, how they snaked down her back, carved with precision and intent. This wasn't accidental violence. Someone had invested time in inflicting this pain. Almost like attempting to inscribe a message, Caleb posed no questions, but noticed how her muscles tensed whenever footsteps sounded on the wooden floors. The third evening, she sat upright unaided, said nothing, just gazed into the flames as if expecting them to speak. Caleb settled nearby, drinking his coffee. Eventually her voice emerged, soft, exhausted. "You didn't touch me." He glanced up, simply nodded. Most men would have. Caleb added another piece of wood to the fire. His words came out low, almost like a private confession. "I ain't most men." Nothing more needed saying. No grand speeches, no theatrical comfort, just that simple truth. Throughout the following week, she began contributing around the homestead. Tended the horses, washed dishes unprompted. One morning, Caleb heard her humming no recognizable melody, but it was genuine sound from someone who'd been utterly voiceless. In that instant, understanding struck him. This transcended merely sheltering an injured stranger. He was witnessing a spirit clawing its way back from an abyss only she could see. But if you imagine recovery follows a predictable course, prepare yourself. What she's preparing to reveal will shatter every assumption. During the second week, her silence finally shattered. Not during meals, not in daylight hours. It happened late, after the fire had dimmed and the coyotes had ceased their howling. Eliza's voice barely rose above breathing. Yet each word landed with devastating force. She revealed to Caleb what had transpired. Not everything, just sufficient details. Enough to make his expression harden like stone. She'd been employed in a county official's estate. Respectable clothing, exhausting shifts, but tolerable initially. Then gambling debts accumulated, and when payment became impossible, he gambled with her instead, a wager he felt comfortable losing. One night, she was seized, restrained, and marked by the very individuals sworn to uphold justice. That scar across her back wasn't random violence. It was a single word carved with a blade: worthless. Caleb offered no immediate response. He stared into the flames, but internally rage simmered. He'd survived warfare, witnessed soldiers eviscerated and abandoned, yet nothing haunted him like this revelation. This wasn't combat. This was pure cowardice, occurring beneath the very flag he'd once sacrificed for. Eliza studied him then, anticipating some reaction, any words. But he remained silent. Simply rose, walked outside, and returned with ink-stained fingers, and a letter resting on the table. Correspondence, addressed to a former military companion in Tucson, who now held significant authority in the garrison. Caleb needed neither weapons nor violence. He required evidence. And Eliza's scars provided precisely that. For the first time, genuine hope flickered in her eyes. Not happiness, not laughter, simply the profound realization that someone acknowledged her suffering as worth documenting. That represented progress. Now, I recognize viewers might wonder what happens next. And if you've stayed this long, you're probably curious exactly how far Caleb's controlled fury will extend, and what that means for Eliza's journey toward reclaiming herself. These are the narratives we share here. And if you want to experience the conclusion, consider subscribing. It keeps you gathered around the fire with us. And trust me, things are about to intensify. 7 days later, the desert delivered a visitor. Not the polite, door-knocking variety. This one approached near sunset, dust clouds trailing his horse, hat concealing his features. The sort of man you instinctively monitor closely. Caleb spotted him from the porch, and before the rider even dismounted, familiar tension tightened in Caleb's chest. Danger announces itself without utterance. The man called out possessively, inquiring whether the delivery had arrived. He avoided using her name. Didn't even reference her as human, just the delivery. That alone made Caleb's jaw clench. He leaned against the post, kept his hand relaxed near his weapon, but didn't draw. The man dismounted heavily, boots striking earth hard, eyes darting toward the cabin window, inside. Eliza watched through gaps in the wood, breath quickening. Shoulders trembling, Caleb extended no hospitality, simply stood in his characteristic stillness, waiting for the stranger's next move. And it came. The man announced his intention to reclaim what never belonged to him. He advanced toward the door. That's when Caleb acted. No shouting, no theatrics, just a swift movement forward, fist clutching the man's collar, other hand pressing cold metal beneath his jaw. The confrontation ended quickly. It needed to. Caleb wasn't seeking to kill, only to conclude things efficiently. Within moments, the intruder lay on the cabin floor, wrists secured with rope, cloth gagging him tight. Eliza didn't celebrate or smile. She remained in the corner, witnessing in disbelief as someone finally created a barrier between her and the men who treated her. Existence as currency to be exchanged. Caleb hauled the stranger outside, secured him to the post, and waited for sunrise. The desert possesses its own way of punishing arrogance. Men arrive believing they can seize whatever they desire. But here the landscape and silence always extract their payment. He knew soldiers from Tucson would pass through soon. They'd receive their evidence. Living, breathing proof this time, not merely a letter. Now, if you assume one man tied to a post concludes this story, you might want to brace yourself. Because when authority gets challenged, it doesn't stay passive, it retaliates. And that retaliation was already approaching. When dawn arrived, Tucson soldiers rode in, dust trailing behind them. Caleb surrendered the bound man along with his previously written letter. They accepted him without hesitation, guilt evident in every aspect of his demeanor. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching the horsemen vanish into the distance. For the first time, she understood the struggle was no longer exclusively hers. Someone had stood beside her, and finally the world had paid attention. The subsequent days felt transformed. No more vigilance for approaching footsteps or threatening shadows. She prepared meals. She worked the property. She even laughed occasionally, shocking both herself and Caleb. He remained characteristically quiet, continuing his work. But the silence they shared had changed, no longer oppressive. It had become peaceful. One evening, seated beside the fire where she'd once whispered her desperate plea, she informed Caleb of her decision to remain. Not because alternatives didn't exist, but because this represented the first place that had offered her autonomy. Caleb didn't respond immediately, just nodded slowly, the kind of acknowledgement that communicates more than countless words on that remote ranch. Distant from political corruption and greed, two individuals discovered that healing doesn't always manifest through violence or drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the sound of water heating on the stove, in a scar that gradually stops aching, in a man who chooses listening over demanding. Perhaps that's what we too frequently forget. That sometimes genuine strength isn't displayed by drawing weapons, but by selecting compassion when cruelty is expected. And perhaps the scars we bear, regardless of their depth, don't represent our ending. They're evidence we continued moving forward. Now, let me pose this question. If you were in Caleb's position, would you have lifted that canvas? Would you have brought her inside? Or would you have turned away like countless others? If this narrative resonated with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It keeps you right here with us, where Old West stories remind us not only of our history, but of who we can still become. Because ultimately, the West was never solely about territory and firearms. It was about people, how shattered and courageous they were.